Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to lecture 15. This is the last lecture of week 3 and also this is the last lecture of performance characteristics of instruments and data analysis part 2. So, we have talked about probability density functions in our previous lecture and we will talk about some more aspects of statistical data analysis in this lecture. So, today's topic is chi-square test of goodness of fit, students t distribution and regression analysis. Let us start with chi-square test of goodness of fit. We have discussed that random experimental errors are expected to follow Gaussian distribution or normal distribution. Now, let us say you have a set of observations, you have performed some experiments in laboratory. Let us say you have measured a pressure or you have measured a temperature and obtained a set of data. Is it possible to say whether this experimental observation match some particular distribution? So, the question we ask is, can we determine if a set of experimental observation match some particular distribution? The chi-square test of goodness of fit can be used to answer this question. Chi-square is defined by this equation. So, you have a set of data and you are expecting a value following some particular distribution for your data. Let us say you assume a normal distribution or you assume some other distribution. So, you have some expected value for the observation. So, you have each observation and you have corresponding expected value for the observation, which follows for some distribution that you have assumed for your data. Now, you find out this quantity observed value minus expected value whole square divided by expected value. These terms you sum for all the observations. So, you pick up one observation, find the difference between observed value and expected value, square it, divide that by expected value. Sum of such terms for all observations. So, that is defined as chi-square. Let us define another term known as degrees of freedom, which is n minus k, where n is number of groups of observations, is also known as number of cells or number of groups of observations, and k equal to number of imposed conditions. for the computed value of chi-square and degree of freedom, you find the probability from the chi-square distribution table. So, once you have the set of data, you find out the chi-square value using the formula that we have talked about. You can calculate the chi-square value for the set of data. You also calculate the degree of freedom. Then there is a table available known as chi-square probability distribution table. Now, look at this chi-square distribution table and find the probability from the table corresponding to degrees of freedom. If the probability lies between 0.1 and 0.9, the observed distribution follows assumed distribution. So, what is done is you find out the chi-square value from the set of data. In principle, if chi-square equal to 0, the distribution in the data is equal to the distribution that you have assumed. Large value of chi-square mean there is deviation or departure from the assumed distribution. So, the data does not follow exactly the distribution that you have assumed for large value of chi-square. Now, what we do is we again consider a level of confidence. So, imagine let us assume that we consider 95% confidence level. So, now we look at the chi-square distribution table corresponding to degrees of freedom, given degrees of freedom and under 95% confidence level, we find out the chi-square value from the table. If our computed chi-square is less than this critical chi-square value obtained from the table, then we say that our assumption about the distribution is good. If our computed chi-square is greater than the obtained critical chi-square from the chi-square distribution table, then the assumption about the distribution in the data is not good. Actually, we should look at both under 95% confidence level, also at the lower level, let us say 0.05%. So, we will take an example to make it more clear. A thermocouple is used to measure the temperature of a known standard maintained at 100 degrees Celsius. After converting the millivolt signal to temperature, the readings are 101.1, 99.8, 100.2, 100.5, 99.6, 100.9, 99.7, 100.1 and 100.3 degrees Celsius. Is the calibration of the thermocouple good? Or in other words, are these values expected? To start with, we must calculate the chi-square value. So, the chi-square value is computed using the formula and we get a value of 0.027. Now, we will make use of the chi-square distribution table, but before that I have to calculate the degrees of freedom. The degrees of freedom here is number of groups of observation minus 1, which is 9 minus 1 equal to 8. Now, we must compare our computed chi-square value, which is 0.027, with a chi-square value in the chi-square distribution table with 8 degrees of freedom. If our calculated value of chi-square exceeds the critical value of chi-square obtained from the table, then we have a significant difference from the expectation. If our chi-square value, our computed chi-square value is less than the critical value of chi-square obtained from the table, then the values we have obtained are, that means data we have obtained are expected. So, from chi-square distribution table with 8 degree of freedom, let us calculate the chi-square corresponding to 95% confidence level as well as 0.05% level. We see that our computed chi-square, which is 0.027, is much less than chi-square at 95% confidence level and chi-square at 5% confidence level. So, we say that the calibration can be considered good at 95% confidence limits. Now, there is another important aspects of distributions known as students T distributions. So, students T distribution is another important aspect of statistical data analysis. In our previous lecture, we have learned about standard error, which is standard deviation divided by square root of number of observation, sigma divided by square root of n. Now, when n is small, this sigma divided by square root of n gives an unreliable estimate of uncertainty. Under such circumstances, or where sample size is small, students proposed an alternative and better way to calculate the uncertainty level. So, let us see what exactly is this. So, standard deviation of the mean in terms of standard deviation of the population is sigma divided by square root of n. For small samples n less than n, this relation is not very reliable. So, students developed a better way for determining confidence interval by introducing something called T, which is defined as this. So, with T, the confidence interval can be written as T sigma by square root of n, where T is a mean of observations minus mean of normal population from which the sample are taken divided by standard deviation and multiply this whole quantity by square root of number of observation, that is square root of n. Let us again take another example to make the point more clear. A thermocouple is used to measure the temperature of a known standard maintained at 100 degrees Celsius. After converting the millivolt signal to temperature, the readings are 101.1, 99.8, 100.2, 100.5, 99.6, 100.9, 99.7, 100.1 and 100.3 degrees Celsius. Obtain the mean measurement and calculate the tolerance limit for 95% confidence level. So, we want to find out the uncertainty associated at the level of 95% confidence. So, the mean can be computed in a straightforward manner from this equation, and it happens to be 100.24 degrees Celsius. So, this is the mean of the measurements. Now, this measurement has to be expressed as this mean of this measurement plus minus some uncertainty. Sigma by square root of n may not be a good idea here because the sample size is small. So, we will make use of students' t distribution. So, we compute the sample standard deviation using the standard formula for standard deviation. The degree of freedom is number of groups of observations minus 1, which is 9 minus 1 equal to 8. Now, you have to look at students' t distribution table, which is available in many standard textbooks of statistical data analysis. If you look under students' distribution table, you will see the value of the t at 95% confidence level is 2.306. Now, let us make use of this formula to compute the level of uncertainty, which is t into standard deviation divided by square root of n. You put the values, t is 2.306, standard deviation is 0.5199 and square root of n is square root of 9 and it happens to be 0.399. So, the temperature measurement is now expressed as the mean 100.24 plus minus 0.39 degrees Celsius. So, we have seen sigma by square root of n as standard error in our previous lecture. Here we multiply this quantity with a term called t, and this value of this t has to be obtained corresponding to a confidence level from students' t distribution table. Now, let us talk about regression analysis. You have input versus output data. So, you have input and corresponding output you have. So, this input output data will allow you to establish a relationship between this output and input, which essentially is the calibration for the instrument. Now, the relationship between input and output may be linear or it may be non-linear. If the instrument is linear, we are expected to get the linear relationship between input and output, and if the relationship is non-linear, we will get a non-linear behavior between output and input. Now, if I have a set of data, I can express this relationship in terms of graph, or I can also express in terms of equations. Here we will take an example of linear regression analysis. That means, given a set of data, we will try to fit a linear equation for this data set. So, if I have x versus y data, I will try to fit an equation like y equal to ax plus b, where x is input and y is output, and a and b are the parameters of the equation. So, the question we ask is, how do I estimate these parameters a and b? Method of least square is a standard approach in regression analysis. The most important application is in data fitting. It finds the line of best fit for a data set. We have a data values as x y and we want to fit y x equal to x plus b. So, how do you compute the values of a and b? So, you want to fit a straight line such as y x equal to x plus b to the data set x y. So, we need to minimize the error, and the error can be represented as the deviation from the true value. If the true value is y I for a particular observation, the equation predicted output is a x I plus b, because y equal to x plus b is the equation that I am fitting in the data set x y. So, for an input x I, the actual output is y I, the output predicted by the equation will be a x I plus b. So, the error will be y I minus a x I plus b. So, sum of all such squared errors must be minimized. In other words, we have to find out the values of A and B such that this error is minimum. Under that situation, y equal to Ax plus b will be a best fit line that passes through the given data set. So, given a data set, I want to fit a straight line such as y equal to Ax plus b. So, I define the error which is yi minus Axi plus b and sum all the squared errors. So, the question now is find values of A and B such that sum of all the squared errors is minimum. This problem is known as least square problem. Finding A and B that minimizes the sum of squared errors for all the observations. So, to find out A and B, what we need to do is we have to take the derivative of this error with respect to parameter A and set it equal to 0. We have to do the same thing for parameter B, that means take the derivative of error with respect to parameter B and set it equal to 0. So, here we will have two equations, we solve these two equations simultaneously and get the values of A and B. So, we take the derivative of the error with respect to A, we have this equation. We take the derivative of error with respect to B, we have this equation. We set these two equal to 0 and solve these two equations simultaneously to obtain A and B. So, this is one equation, this is another equation. We can write this in this matrix form. The solution becomes A equal to this and B equal to this. So, the values of parameters A and B can be obtained from these two expressions. So, this is about linear regression. But you cannot always fit a linear equation through the data. Let us say your y versus x relationship is something like this. We cannot fit a straight line. Can you try an mth degree polynomial? It will be a nonlinear calibration. So, we can try an mth order, mth degree polynomial similar to linear regression. In this case also we must minimize this error and again take the derivative of this error with respect to these parameters and set those derivatives equal to 0 and obtained equations will be solved simultaneously to find out the values of parameters. So, this is how we can fit an mth order polynomial through the data. but we will do this only if the linear equation does not fit the data. So, how do I know that my fit is good? So, there should be a measure of goodness of fit. There is something called correlation coefficient, which conveys how good is the fit by either least square method or graphical curve fitting. So, correlation coefficient is a measure of goodness of fit. Correlation coefficient is defined by this equation. Note that you have terms like sigma yx and sigma y. So, sigma y is this and sigma yx is this. Yi are actual value of y and yic are value computed from the correlation coefficient equation for same value of x. For a perfect fit, the value of correlation coefficient r will be equal to 1. If the value is very close to 1, the goodness of fit is high. So, fit is good when the value of the correlation coefficient is close to 1. So, correlation coefficient will tell you how good your fit is. Once you have fitted a linear equation or non-linear equation, your correlation coefficient will tell you how good is the fit. So, you fit a linear equation and find out the correlation coefficient. If it is close to 1, let us say 0.995, the fitness is very good. So, this is end of week 3. We have covered performance characteristics of instruments and data analysis part 2, that was the major topic, under which we have talked about numerical examples on first order and second order instruments. We have taken examples of thermometer as first order system, we have taken U2 manometer as second order instrument, we have analyzed them. We have talked about types of measurement errors. We have seen how to compute component errors, to calculate overall system accuracy. Then we have discussed some basic statistical analysis of data. In particular, we have talked about probability distribution functions, we have talked about students t-test, we have talked about chi-square test for goodness of fit, and we have briefly touched upon linear regression analysis. So, this closes lectures of week 3, and you will be given assignments for these topics that we have covered over this week.